The morning the HOA board sent me a certified letter demanding I resume free snow plowing services or face a formal fine, I was sitting at my kitchen table with coffee and a legal pad, writing down every number I could remember from 7 years of getting up at 4:30 in the morning to clear a road that kept 73 families safe. And the total I reached before I finished my first cup was $18,400 out of my own pocket. I folded that piece of paper, put it in my shirt pocket, and drove to the post office to sign for their letter. The woman behind the counter handed me the envelope with the expression of someone who had handled enough certified mail to know that the ones people drove in specifically to collect were usually the interesting ones. I signed the receipt and drove home and read the letter at my kitchen table, and then I made a second cup of coffee and started writing down a different set of numbers entirely. My name is Garrett Holt. I am 52 years old, a third-generation heavy equipment operator with 30 years of experience moving dirt, gravel, and snow across the mountain communities of southwestern Colorado, and I have lived in the Ridgecrest HOA development in Pinewood Summit for 8 years. The development sits at 9,000 feet elevation in a valley that collects weather the way a bowl collects rain, surrounded on 3 sides by ridgelines that funnel the prevailing winter winds directly into the community from the northwest. The single-access road is 2.4 miles of switchback grades that average 17%, with sections reaching 22, dropping from the county highway down into the valley floor where the 73 homes are clustered. The county maintains the highway. Nobody maintains the access road except whoever Ridgecrest HOA contracts to do it, which for 7 of my 8 years in the community had been me. For free, because that is the kind of thing you do when you have the equipment and the capability and the community needs it, and you believe that living somewhere means being responsible for it. I owned a Ford F-550 with a 10-foot commercial plow blade, a hydraulic system I maintained myself, and a diesel tank I filled every October in preparation for the season. The truck had done this road for 7 winters before the situation that ended that arrangement. In those 7 winters, I had plowed through 31 significant storm events, maintained the road through hundreds of smaller accumulations, and kept the access clear for school buses, delivery vehicles, emergency services, and the daily lives of 73 families who lived at an elevation where winter was not a season but a condition. The previous board president was a man named Howard Birch, who had retired from 30 years as a county road superintendent and who understood better than anyone in the community what the road represented and what it cost to maintain it. Howard's philosophy was simple, and he stated it often at board meetings in the community center with the flat declarative certainty of a man who had spent his career making things work. "You take care of the road," he said, "and the road takes care of you." He had approached me in my first winter in the community with a proposition that made sense to both of us. I would plow the access road during storm events, and the HOA would drop their contracted plowing service, saving the community approximately $2,600 per significant storm event in contractor fees. I asked for nothing in return except the understanding that I would operate on my schedule, meaning I would be on the road by 4:30 on storm mornings, so the access was clear before the school bus needed it at 7. Howard had shaken my hand and said that was the best deal Ridgecrest had made since they paved the parking lot. For 7 years that was the deal. I kept my end precisely. 31 storms, 4:30 starts, 10-foot blade, the access road clear before anyone needed it. I tracked my fuel costs because I track everything, and over 7 years those costs totaled $14,200. I tracked maintenance costs attributable to the additional plow work, another $4,000 and change. I tracked the hours, which I did not attempt to monetize, because you do not monetize the hours you spend doing something because it is right. The financial number was $18,400. The hours number was something I kept in a different column. Howard Birch's wife was diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition 18 months ago. They sold their house in October and moved to a ground-floor apartment in Durango to be near her medical team. Howard resigned from the board by email, a 2-sentence message that said he was leaving the community and wished everyone well. I drove down to say goodbye the day they loaded the moving truck. Howard shook my hand in the driveway and said, watch yourself with whoever comes next. Not everyone understands what this community requires. He had been watching the board election with the specific concern of someone who could see what was coming and knew he would not be present to counterbalance it. What came next was Nora Aldridge. Nora was 57, recently retired from a corporate human resources position in Denver, and she had moved to Pinewood Summit 18 months ago with her husband Paul for what she described at the HOA meet and greet as a lifestyle reset. She had the organized efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing personnel systems and the particular confidence of someone who believed that any problem was fundamentally a management problem and therefore within her competence to address. She ran for board president on a platform of operational accountability, by which she meant she wanted contracts for everything and documentation of every expenditure and a formal framework for every service the community relied on. On paper, this was not unreasonable. In practice, it meant that my 7 years of handshake arrangement with Howard became, in Nora's framing, an unacceptable liability exposure and an undocumented service relationship that the board could not properly oversee. She came to my door in October, 3 weeks after taking office, with a printed document she called a service provider agreement. She wanted me to sign it. The agreement formalized my plowing role with specific language about liability, insurance requirements, performance standards, and board oversight of my operations. It also included a clause stating that the arrangement was compensatory on a volunteer basis, meaning unpaid, and that I was providing services as a community contribution with no expectation of remuneration. I read the agreement at my kitchen table while she waited in my entryway. I read it twice. I said, "Nora, this agreement asks me to accept formal contractual obligations, including liability exposure, performance standards that could trigger penalties, and board oversight of my operations, in exchange for nothing." She said, "You have been providing these services voluntarily for 7 years. This simply formalizes the existing arrangement." I said the existing arrangement was a handshake with Howard based on mutual understanding and good faith. This is a contract with liability clauses that I would be signing without compensation. She said the community cannot accept services without a formal framework. It creates legal exposure. I said the legal exposure you are describing did not exist for 7 years under Howard's arrangement. She said that is because Howard was not operating the community properly. I said Howard was operating the community the way mountain communities operate when they work, which is people taking care of each other because nobody else is going to. She looked at me with the expression of someone who had heard this kind of sentiment before and categorized it as resistance to proper management. She said, "I understand the sentiment, but the board needs formal accountability from all service providers." I said, "I will think about it." She left the agreement on my kitchen counter. I put it in my documentation folder, which I had started keeping on day 1 of Nora's tenure because Howard's parting advice had been specific and I had taken it seriously. I spent 2 weeks thinking about it. I consulted a property attorney named Karen Howell in Durango who I had used for my house closing. She read the agreement and said, "This contract asks you to accept professional contractor obligations with no compensation and waive all claims for reimbursement of past services. Do not sign this." I said, "What are my options?" She said, "Decline the agreement and continue the informal arrangement. Decline the agreement and cease services, or negotiate terms that include fair compensation for the work and proper allocation of liability." I sent Nora a written response through Karen. It declined the agreement as written and proposed that if the board required a formal service arrangement, it should include compensation at the prevailing commercial rate for mountain road plowing services in Canijos County, which Karen had researched at $1,900 per significant storm event, plus reimbursement of fuel and maintenance costs. It also requested a formal board acknowledgement of the 7 years of prior service and a recognition that the community had saved approximately $68,000 in contractor fees during that period. Nora's response came to Karen within a week. It said the board did not recognize any obligation for prior volunteer services and did not find the proposed compensation appropriate for a community member providing a local service. It said the board was prepared to put the service arrangement out for competitive bid if I was unwilling to continue under the volunteer framework. Karen called me after receiving the response. She said, "She just told you that 7 years of service have no value and that she will replace you with a bid contractor." I said, "Yes." Karen said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to let her find out what a bid contractor actually costs and what it means to rely on one at 9,200 feet in a southwestern Colorado winter." Karen said, "That is a reasonable position. Do you want me to formally confirm that you are not continuing under the volunteer arrangement?" I said, "Send the letter." The letter went to Nora in November, 30 days before the first significant storm of the season. It stated clearly that I would not be providing snow plowing services to Ridgecrest HOA under the proposed volunteer agreement or on any informal basis going forward, and that I wished the board well in securing alternative arrangements. Nora sent an HOA-wide email 2 days later announcing that the board was finalizing a professional snow removal contract with a qualified service provider and that residents could be confident the access road would be maintained to the highest standards. She had 3 weeks to find that provider before the first real storm. The provider she found was a company called Summit Clear Services operating out of a town 40 miles south. Their equipment was sized for residential driveways and moderate commercial lots. Their lead operator had 3 years of experience and had not worked roads above 8,000 feet. Their contract rate was $2,200 per activation, with a 4-hour response window from time of request, meaning they would arrive within 4 hours of Nora calling them, not within 4 hours of snow beginning to fall. In a storm that dropped 2 feet in 12 hours, 4 hours of response time from the moment someone picked up the phone meant the road would be significantly buried before the first blade touched it. I read the contract terms because Karen had requested a copy as part of her monitoring of the situation. I called her after reading it. I said, "The response window is 4 hours from activation, not from storm onset." She said, "I saw that." I said, "And their equipment is rated for grades up to 12%. Our road averages 17." She said, "I saw that too." I said, "They are going to have a very difficult winter." Karen said, "Document everything. If something goes wrong, the documentation will matter." I documented everything. I kept my trail camera system running along the access road, which I had installed 2 years earlier after a boundary dispute with a neighboring parcel, and which covered the road entrance from a vantage point on my property. I logged weather events with the National Weather Service data, time-stamped to the hour. I noted every storm onset, every activation call timeline I could observe, every period when the road was buried and impassable. The first significant storm of the season arrived in late November. 14 inches over 18 hours, moderate by Pinewood Summit standards, but enough to bury the road to the point where passenger vehicles could not pass without a cleared lane. I watched from my kitchen window at 4:30 in the morning, the time I would have been firing up my truck for 7 years, and drank my coffee and did nothing. Summit Clear Services arrived at 9:40 in the morning, 5 hours and 20 minutes after Nora had called them at 4:20. By 9:40, the road had been accumulating for 12 hours, and the drifting on the north-facing sections had created walls 4.5 feet high in 2 locations. Their equipment made 2 passes before the operator called Nora to report that the grades were presenting challenges beyond their rated capacity and that they needed to bring different equipment on the next visit. I watched this from the road camera footage on my phone from my kitchen table. The school bus could not access the community that day. 4 children missed school. 1 resident, an elderly woman named Rosa Caldwell, who had a weekly physical therapy appointment in town, could not leave until nearly noon when the road was finally passable. Her physical therapist charged a late cancellation fee. I documented all of this through conversations with neighbors who called me, some asking for help, all of which I answered the same way, and some simply telling me what was happening. I told everyone who asked for help that I was no longer providing plowing services and that they should contact the board. I wrote down the substance of every call in my documentation log. The certified letter arrived 6 days after the first storm. It was from Nora on HOA letterhead, and it said the board had determined that my withdrawal of snow plowing services constituted a breach of community obligation and that I was being formally notified that continued refusal to assist with road maintenance during emergency weather conditions would result in a fine of $500 per storm event. I called Karen after reading it. She said, "She is fining you for not doing free work." I said, "Yes." Karen said, "This is not legally supportable. You have no contractual obligation. You withdrew from the informal arrangement with formal written notice 30 days prior. There is no CC&R provision requiring homeowners to provide services. This fine has no foundation." I said, "I know. I want to respond formally." Karen's response letter went to Nora that week. It was 4 pages. It documented my 7 years of service, the $18,400 in personal costs I had tracked, the $68,000 in contractor fees the community had saved, the formal October proposal to continue under compensated terms, the board's rejection of that proposal, and the November notice letter withdrawing my services with 30 days advance notice. It stated that the fine had no legal foundation under the CC&RS or under any principle of contract law, and that I would not be paying it. It also stated that if the board attempted to place a lien on my property based on this fine, I would seek immediate injunctive relief and pursue all available legal remedies. It also included something Karen had added at my specific request: a formal invoice for 7 years of services rendered, calculated at the prevailing commercial rate Karen had researched, less a community contribution discount of 40% that I had decided was fair given that I had genuinely wanted to help for most of those 7 years. The net figure after the discount was $31,200. Nora did not respond to the letter for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, the second significant storm arrived, 22 inches over 36 hours, with sustained winds that created drifts the National Weather Service classified as severe. I watched from my window and documented everything. Summit Clear Services activated 4 hours and 10 minutes after Nora's call. They arrived with upgraded equipment this time, a larger blade unit they had apparently rented from a supplier, but the operator had no experience with the specific grade geometry of the Ridgecrest access road and spent the first 40 minutes working the wrong approach angle on the steepest switchback section, which packed the snow laterally instead of clearing it and created a compacted wall that took another hour to address. Total time from storm onset to passable road was 9 hours and 40 minutes. During those 9 hours, a family with a newborn who had developed a fever was unable to leave the community. Emergency services were called, and the ambulance reached the road entrance but could not ascend. The family ultimately received guidance by phone from a pediatric nurse line, and the infant was fine, but the family spent 4 hours unable to reach medical care if it had been needed. I documented this through the family themselves, who were neighbors named the Castillos, and who called me at 7 in the morning asking if there was anything I could do. I told them I could not plow the road and gave them the pediatric nurse line number and stayed on the phone with them for 20 minutes making sure they had what they needed. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Donna came downstairs and found me there and asked what was wrong, and I told her about the Castillo baby. She sat down across from me and we were quiet for a while. She said, "You are doing the right thing." I said, "It does not feel like it this morning." She said, "Howard told you to watch yourself with whoever came next. You watched yourself, you gave proper notice, you made a fair proposal. She rejected it and called you a liability and tried to fine you for not working for free. The Castillo baby is safe. What is happening to this community is happening because of the choices Nora made, not the choices you made." I said, I know that. She said, then let it keep happening until the community sees it clearly. I said, yes. She made more coffee, and I went back to my documentation log. The second storm generated 41 phone calls and text messages to me from community residents over the following 48 hours. I answered every one with the same response. I am not providing plowing services this season. Please contact the board. I logged every contact with the time and the caller. Nora sent an HOA-wide email after the second storm. The subject line was regarding recent snow removal challenges. The body attributed the difficulties to unprecedented weather conditions and equipment calibration issues with the new contractor and expressed confidence that performance would improve. It did not mention my name. It did not mention the board's rejection of my compensation proposal. It did not mention the fine they had sent me or Karen's 4-page response. 3 board members called me in the week after the email. Not Nora. The other 3, a retired teacher named Sandra Polk, a contractor named James Weir, and a young couple's representative named Amy Cho, who had moved in 2 years ago and who I had always found straightforward. All 3 called to tell me, in varying degrees of directness, that they had not been fully informed about the history of the situation before the first storm, and that they had now read Karen's letter and the invoice and wanted to understand my position. I gave each of them the full account: the October meeting with Nora, the proposed agreement, Karen's advice, my compensation proposal, the board's rejection, the 30-day notice letter, the fine. I sent each of them the documentation folder Karen had compiled. Sandra Polk called me back after reviewing the folder. She said, Nora told the board you had simply refused to cooperate with the formalization process and withdrawn your services out of obstinance. She did not tell us you had made a compensation proposal that the board rejected. I said the compensation proposal is in Karen's letter, which was sent to the full board. Sandra said, Nora manages the board correspondence. I did not see that letter until you sent me the folder. I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, Sandra, I want you to think carefully about what you just told me. She was quiet, then she said, yes, I am thinking about it. The third storm arrived in January. 38 inches over 4 days, the kind of event that the National Weather Service classifies as historic, the kind that changes the character of a winter in the memory of everyone who lives through it. I watched the forecast build for 5 days before it arrived, and I serviced my truck and sharpened my blade and checked my hydraulics, because I am an equipment operator and I maintain my equipment regardless of whether I am using it. And I made sure everything was ready because I had a decision to make, and I wanted the equipment to be ready for either outcome. The storm hit on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, 30 inches had fallen and the road was gone. Not buried, gone. The drifting on the north-facing sections had created formations 8 feet high in 2 places, and the road surface was invisible under a uniform white depth that my years of experience told me was between 4 and 5 feet at the average across the switchback grades. Summit Clear Services called Nora at 6 in the morning to tell her their equipment could not safely operate in these conditions and that they were suspending operations until the storm passed and the road became accessible by their units. Their contract, as Karen had noted when she reviewed it, included a force majeure clause that permitted them to suspend operations during weather events that exceeded their operational parameters. 38 inches, with drifts to 8 feet, exceeded their operational parameters. The community was sealed. Nora called me at 6:22. I know the time because I logged it. I answered. She said, Garrett, we have a serious situation. I said, I know. She said, Summit Clear cannot operate. The road is completely buried. I need you to plow. I said, I am not providing plowing services this season. I notified the board of that in November with 30 days advance notice. She said, this is an emergency. I said, I understand that. I also understand that the board was advised in November that an emergency of this kind was a foreseeable consequence of rejecting my compensation proposal and contracting with a service provider whose equipment and experience were not rated for this road. She said, Garrett, people are trapped. I said, yes, they have been trapped for 6 hours. Yesterday they were told by your board email that performance would improve. The performance did not improve because the contractor does not have the equipment or the experience for this road, which I told you in writing in October. She said, what do you want? I said, I want the board to withdraw the $500 fine with a formal written apology. I want a board resolution acknowledging the 7 years of service and the $18,400 in personal costs I documented. I want a formal service agreement at the rate Karen proposed, $1,900 per activation plus fuel and maintenance, retroactive to the start of this season. And I want the board to vote on my invoice for prior services at the next regular meeting with full community attendance. She said, I cannot commit to all of that without a board vote. I said, then convene an emergency board vote. You have phones. There was a long silence. I watched the snow fall through my kitchen window. The road below the house was a smooth white field with no visible surface. She said, give me 30 minutes. I gave her 45. She called back at 7:51. She said the board has voted. Fine withdrawn. Written apology will be issued. Service agreement at your proposed rate effective immediately. Prior service acknowledgement will be addressed at the next meeting. We need you on the road. I said, I need the vote confirmation in writing before I start the truck. She said, James Weir is sending you an email from his phone right now. James Weir's email arrived at 7:53. It confirmed the board vote 4-1 on all terms. The one dissenting vote was Nora's own. I put on my work gear, went to the garage, started the truck, and had the blade down at the road entrance by 8:15. The storm was still dropping, but the rate had slowed and the wind had shifted, which meant the new accumulation was manageable if you worked steadily and kept the blade moving. I cleared the first switchback in 40 minutes. The upper grades took longer because the drift formations required approach angles that only someone who knew this road could calculate correctly, the specific geometry of how the wind came off the northwest ridge and deposited the heaviest snow at the outside edge of each turn. I had been reading that geometry for 8 years. I knew every foot of it. By 11:30, the road was passable. A single lane, enough for emergency vehicles and careful resident traffic. I made a second full pass in the afternoon that opened it to full width. Rosa Caldwell was standing at her driveway when I passed her house on the second run. She was 81 years old and had lived in Ridgecrest for 19 years and had known my predecessor on the road, a man who had plowed it before me for 12 years and who Rosa spoke about with the specific warmth of someone remembering a person who had made her feel safe. She raised her hand when I passed, and I stopped the truck. She said, "Thank you, Garrett." I said, "Sorry it took longer than usual this year, Rosa." She said, "Howard always said you were the best operator who had ever worked this road." I said, "Howard was generous." She said, "Howard was accurate." She went back inside. I finished the second pass and drove home and parked the truck and went inside and told Donna it was done. She asked how the road was. I said it was clear and correct. She said good and handed me a bowl of soup, and we sat at the kitchen table, and the house was warm, and outside the storm had fully stopped, and the mountains were silent the way they get after a heavy snow when everything is covered, and the world seems to have paused to take stock of itself. The board meeting 2 weeks later was the most attended in Ridgecrest HOA history. 61 of 73 households sent a representative. I presented the full documentation of the season, the storms, the response times, the incidents, the Castillo family, Rosa Caldwell's cancelled appointments, the 11 children who had missed a combined 23 school days across the 3 major events. I presented the invoice for 7 years of prior services and the financial analysis showing the community had saved $68,000 in contractor fees during that period. The community voted 60-1 to approve a 5-year service agreement at the negotiated rate. They voted 58-3 to approve a payment of $22,000 in recognition of prior services, which was less than the invoice amount, but which the board proposed, and I accepted because the gesture mattered more than the number. Nora voted no on both measures. She resigned from the board the following week by email, 2 sentences, personal reasons. The email had a familiar brevity. Sandra Polk was elected president in her place. The first thing she did was call me to say that the community was grateful and that she intended to make sure what happened this year never happened again. I told her I appreciated that and that I would be on the road at 4:30 every storm morning for as long as I lived in Ridgecrest and my truck was running. She said, "That is all we ever needed." I said, "I know, Howard knew it too." She said, "Yes, he did." The season finished with 4 more significant storms after the January event. I cleared every one of them before 5 in the morning. The road was always open before the school bus needed it, and always clear before Rosa Caldwell's appointments required her to leave. Summit Clear Services did not return after January. Their contract was formally terminated in February with no dispute from either side. On the last morning of plowing season in April, I made my final pass on the access road as the sun came up over the eastern ridge, and the light came down into the valley the way it only comes in April in the high country, clean and specific, and carrying the particular warmth of a winter that is finally finished. The road was dry and clear, and the edges were crisp, and the surface was exactly as it should be. I drove back up to the house and parked the truck and sat in the cab for a moment looking at the valley below. 73 homes, 1 road, 2.4 miles of switchback grades that connected everything down there to everything out here. Someone had to know how to read it, and someone had to be willing to get up at 4:30 and take care of it because nobody else was going to. That had always been true. It would keep being true. The mountains did not care about service agreements or board votes or management frameworks. They cared about whether the road was clear. I turned off the truck and went inside. The road was clear. That was the whole job. That had always been the whole job. Thumbnail text, she fined him for not plowing for free. The next blizzard changed everything. Sonnet 4, 6 Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.